So, welcome. Once again, I'm Eric Einhorn. I'm the General Artistic Director of On-Site Opera. I'm joined by our Music Director, Geoff McDonald, our Director of Production and Artistic Operations, Chris Staub. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's panel on the Janáček Diary of One Who Vanished, which I hope you've all enjoyed. You've had no problem listening to, receiving. I understand we were just talking before we let everyone into the room about some of the challenges of producing a project through the mail. And I know many of you have experienced the frustration and heartache of partnering with the United States Postal Service on this. And I want to send a blanket thank you for your understanding and patience, as we have also been navigating this and these unexpected challenges. But we are thrilled to be able to talk about Janáček's diary, and more globally, the topic of Romani culture in this song cycle, and also in the classical music and opera literature beyond that. So, like I said, I'm joined by Geoff McDonald, our music director, and also our special guest today is Dr. Petra Gelbart, who is a Romani educator, musician, and music therapist. She earned her PhD in ethnomusicology at Harvard and has a master's in music psychotherapy from Molloy College. She's the co-founder of the Initiative for Romani Music at NYU, and more recently, Families of Roma and Sinti Holocaust Victims. She currently lives in her home country, the Czech Republic, although she is now touched down back in the US for a spell. Welcome back.
No longer quite accurate. It's always a back and forth.
And excellent. And she teaches remotely currently at Ramapo College of New Jersey. And as a music therapist, she works with seniors in rehabilitation settings with children and with foster families. So Dr. Petra Gelbart, thank you so much for joining us again for this
Thank you for having me.
Conversation. So, Romani culture.
So, all right, so I'll get started. I'm gonna ask you guys a couple of questions. If you are anywhere in Europe, you are not disqualified, but I expect a certain level of knowledge from you that I don't expect for people living in America. That's totally okay. This is definitely not meant to embarrass anybody, because everybody's pretty much in the same situation. Almost everybody in America is coming from a place where they were not taught anything about Roma. It's not your fault, but we are here to remedy that. So the first little exercise we're going to do, you can either kind of unmute yourself and speak up, or you can use the chat. So just things that you have heard about so-called gypsies. So the good, the bad, the ugly, the stereotypes, whatever the first thing that comes to mind. Anything you want to share. Again, there's no judgment. I'm not gonna think you're racist or whatever, but it's just a really good thing to get out there in terms of like, what is the public consciousness about these mysterious people. So go ahead, let's hear it. All right, so we got Nomadic, we've got Carmen.
Sorry, I was just going to say, from the UK, there is a lovely image that comes to mind of on Heartbeat, which is a soap where a lovely gypsy caravan comes rolling into town to the tune of Simon and Garfunkel, Scarborough Fair. So that is but I think that's a sort of a typical stereotype that the gypsies are coming to town and they're going to bring trouble, which they do. And then in the soap, of course, it's all resolved at the end of it because, the law wins. But I think that is a typical misconception, and it's been bred by the TV. We've had TV programs about gypsies, and in fact, there's been something on Whole Live recently about them causing trouble and being fine, which is totally unfair.
But yeah, I know there was a program in the UK really just like weeks ago. That was on, I guess it was on Travelers. I mean, that was the idea. And of course, in the UK, it's a complicated thing because it's hard to kind of pick apart ethnic Roma and Travelers. But I know that was it was a big to do on Twitter around that particular program and how unfair it was. I didn't see it. But I trust people that it was not flattering. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So we've got some great things. Somebody made a spoiler, and that's okay. Yes, we are originally from India. We have a Holocaust mention. Yes, media stereotypes are completely ridiculous, although, you know, doesn't mean that no stereotype has any grounding in truth. There's various stereotypes that, depending on the location, might be more truthful than you might think. Okay, well, these are great. All right, artist, free spirit. That's a big one in the arts, right? That's where a lot of the kind of inspiration for writers and composers comes from, is the idea that we are free spirits. I want to bookmark that. That's a really important one to come back to. Thieves, dancing, music. Absolutely, those are the stereotypes. Discriminated against, yes. Gypsies, trans, and thieves. Yeah, my personal favorite. Mysterious, beautiful women, cutthroat men. You were like that movie, if anybody's seen it, Gypsies Go to Heaven. That's right there. Like mysterious, beautiful women and cutthroat men. I cannot stand that movie, but many of my Romani fellow musicians they just love it. It's got good music. Horses, yes, it's true. We love horses. Wealth passed down, very good. We do have wealth passed down in gold jewelry. Not all of us, but the idea being that the safest place for your gold is on your person, and gold is a good place a good sort of safe, reliable place to have your family wealth. So this is mostly like gold I've gotten from family members. Fiddling, violins, yes. Horses, caravans. Now there was one that I saw that I missed. Oh, the Rebel Angels. I'm so impressed. I read that so many years ago. And it was, yeah, it's an interesting one. But I'm not going to get into it, but I'm impressed that somebody else has read it. Music, music, and music. Yes. Okay. This is great. So this is a really great start. Okay. So we've gotten India out of the way, the animal chorus. We've gotten India out of the way. So the language that we currently speak, not all Roma speak Romani, but those of us who do, and I do speak fluent Romani. In fact, I teach my children Romani to various extents. Oh my goodness. Okay, it's hard. I get so distracted. It's not your fault. This is great. Just keep them coming. But now I'm just fascinated by medical social worker. Yeah, in Chicago in the 1980s. Yeah, see, that would have been I can almost envision that situation, and it's very different from my own personal experience. But I've heard about other situations in America where Roma came to hospitals. And in fact, as a music therapist, I was once given a handbook of sort of like different cultures in the hospital that you might encounter. And I think based on, this kind of experience of sort of typical American Roma, of the fortune telling variety, being in hospitals and having, their kind of ritual purity issues and a lot of family and all of that. So this is kind of, like a manual's like, how do you respond? How do you deal with these people? They've got this strict culture, blah, 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 blah. And as somebody who comes from, very different kind of, actually not that different, but like generationally very different Romani family, is kind of like, wow, if I tell somebody in a hospital that I'm Romani and they expect this from me, there's going to be a huge misunderstanding. But, people are trying to be culturally sensitive. It's just that the thing to realize with Roma is that we are just like Jews. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we are as different from each other as ultra-Orthodox Jews are from atheist Jews. Literally, the entire spectrum of kind of being traditional and adhering to ritual purity laws, having various sort of religious affiliations or lack thereof. I mean, mostly Roma are quite religious, but in terms of that kind of older layer of traditional culture, things going all the way back to India in terms of ritual purity, you have the full gamut. You also have a full scale of socioeconomic positions, education levels, tends to skew towards definitely a lot less educated and tends to skew towards poorer, but we have just across the board. So the best way to understand Roma or kind of gypsies in general is to think of Jewish people. It's perfect because if you understand the diversity there, then you'll understand the diversity of Roma. Bury me standing. Ah, yes. I have a love-hate relationship with that one. A love-hate relationship with a lot of these representations. So yeah, so our language is Indic. It's very easy. There we go. Okay. Carol Miller, good question. I'm just coming to that. Is it similar to Romanian? No, not at all. So Roma were enslaved in Romania for 500 years. So there are Romanian loan words in most Romani dialects, and then the dialects of the Roma that particularly came out of that slavery situation, which is a lot of Roma, including most of the Roma in the United States today. They do have a lot of Romanian borrowings, but the language itself is not close to Romanian or Latin-based at all. It's closest to Hindi and Punjabi. The core vocabulary is about 60% Sanskrit-based. So it's most definitely absolutely an Indic language. I live in a Bengali and Indian and Pakistani neighborhood here in New York City, and I say certain things to my kids and people kind of turn around and they assume that my husband must be South Asian. Because like I'll give you an example. So if you count to 5 in Hindi, it's ek, do, tin, char, panch. In Romani, it's yek, doi, trin, shtar, panch. It's almost identical. Words for like hair, hands, nose, that kind of thing. They're almost identical. They're not mutually intelligible. You cannot have a conversation with a Hindi speaker between Hindi and Romani. It's not going to happen. But vocabulary clearly has that origin. All right, so we have the history, your whirlwind tour of history. Our ancestors left India around 1,000 years ago. And then again, sort of everything and anything happened from that point on. There was nomadicism, and there was a lot of not nomadicism. So actually a lot of Roma settled a long time ago, centuries and centuries ago. And the absolute vast majority of Roma have been settled, as in not nomadic at all, for well over 100 or 200 years now. So that is, I would say, probably the single biggest misconception that people have is that the defining, and in fact, if you look at even like the Webster's Dictionary or whatever, source like that, like these authoritative sources that say, Roma or gypsies are characterized by nomadicism, or like traditionally characterized by nomadicism. It's like, well, I mean, Jews used to be nomadic. So it's almost getting to that point where it's like, well, yes, we have a few Roma that are, and Romani people that are still nomadic, but it's a tiny minority. So I want to go back to, somebody said free-spirited, and that's a really great one because it informs how just what everybody talks about is, and not just in the arts, but also in policy. So government policies, talking about kids going to school. Oh, but they're so free-spirited. We have to like deal with them not following rules and things like that. So this is hilarious. I know where it's coming from, and it's coming from two things. One is just the projection, this psychological phenomenon where people who are living in Euro-American cultures, people who are of the majority ethnicity, tend to have a need to kind of project various parts of their psyche onto an other, right? Like an other with a capital O, where they sort of want to have permission to act wild and unfettered and things like that. And so that's where kind of all the various art inspiration comes in. If we're sort of communing with the gypsies, then we can be in touch with our primal something or other, right? It has very little to do with Roma themselves and everything to do with the psychological need that people have. But also many Roma have been musicians and dancers. And so that lends itself to this idea of like, well, you know, musicians and dancers are very expressive. And so it's a kind of free-spirited kind of thing. Here is the bad news. We are some of the least, traditionally speaking, we are some of the least free-spirited people that you'll ever meet, because our traditional cultures are so strict. There's so many laws that you have to adhere to, social laws and purity laws and like ways you cook and ways you dress, things you can and can't do. And even in like my Romani family, which doesn't do most of these kind of older traditional things, but you definitely can't just do whatever you want. That's not a thing at all. You have to, you basically have to fall in line or people are going to be unhappy. So we don't really do free-spirited. Okay, let's see.
Petra, I wonder if you can take us through the differentiation that between Roma and Gypsy, because I know that's in the arts that is certainly the prevalent terminology. So what's liked, what's preferred, what is not?
Excellent, and thank you for keeping me from totally rambling. So great question. So why are Roma called Roma? It doesn't have, we've covered the Romania thing. That's just a coincidence. It has nothing to do with Romania. It doesn't have anything to do with Rome. As far as we know, we used to be called Dom, which is sort of like a caste or a professional grouping of people in India. And from Dom came the Lom, which you can still find in Central Asia. They're cousins of ours. They also speak a Sanskrit-derived language. And then from Lom, you have the Rom or the Roma in Europe. So, and as you will see in like the word Inuit, that also means the people. So there are various languages in which the word for a person is also kind of the ethnonym. So it's like that for Roma. So Rom just means man. Roma means the people. So why does everybody call us gypsies? Because when we came to places like Spain and the UK, people thought we were from Egypt for various reasons, mostly because Roma were dark. There was another thing where they actually had gone from this place called Little Egypt and said that. Nobody really knows exactly. But the idea is that nobody knew that we came from India and people thought we were from Egypt. And so we were called Egyptians in English, from which we get gypsy, and Gitanos in Spanish, from which we get Gitanos, which is the same etymology as gypsies. So before I get to what's preferred, there's a really important point here, which is why is so much of the artistic and literary representation of Roma as nomadic people, when in fact that's such a small part of the Romani population. And there's a good reason for that, because as English speakers, a lot of what we're exposed to is going to be based in English, and if not that, then probably French or German. And those happen to be the places where Roma have been nomadic for a lot longer, or even where other places it was like barely a thing or not a thing at all. In the United Kingdom, also Germany, and also France, that's where you still today have nomadic Roma. So it's kind of a coincidence, but you know, so people aren't entirely wrong to say, you know, gypsies like to travel, because you have a lot of Romani people who say, yes, we would like to travel. It's a big part of our culture, and that includes Sinti. Sinti and Manouche are German and French based Romani people. Don't call them Roma, they don't like that, but they're, you know, same kind of background, and they really do traditionally like to travel, unlike the rest of us. Now, what's preferred? It's a tough one. The activists and academics, so Romani academics, Romani activists will say very often, do not call us gypsies. We don't like it. I don't like it. I'll tell you why. In America, it's a big problem because people tend to not realize we're an ethnic group. So you have gypsy cabs, gypsy moths, gypsies. It's a lifestyle. Anybody can have this bohemian lifestyle. I mean, it's just a mess. You go and you want to have an actual job, like a serious job, and somebody finds out that you're a gypsy. They're going to get all sorts of the wrong ideas that we really don't like. We just don't want to be associated with that whole semantic field at all. But there are people in again, going back to the UK, the vast majority of Romanis in the UK who didn't come there more recently, like from places like where I am, the Czech Republic and other parts of Eastern Europe, they actually call themselves gypsies. So the official term in the UK is gypsies, as GRT, gypsies, Roma, and travelers. And these are sort of separate but very interrelated groups. So you can't really tell those people not to call themselves gypsies. And there's this whole kind of Twitter war and and other war between, even just between activists, where some activists are like, we must stop using the word gypsy. It's really insulting and it's bad. And, it gives people the wrong idea. And then other people just sort of saying like, but that's what we call ourselves and you can't tell us to stop, right?
Right.
So I'm kind of, I'm always a peacemaker. I'm I have my own personal preference. I do not like it when, if I've said I'm Romani and somebody continues to call me a gypsy, I'll judge you. Honestly, I will judge you if you call me a gypsy, because I've told you that I don't prefer that. But it's just like with autistic, right? Like I have an autistic son. It's with the person first or identity first language. It's a very similar thing. You have people who say it's rude to say autistic person. You should always put the person first and say person with autism. But you have a lot of autistic self-advocates who say, no, it's not a disease. I don't have autism. I am autistic and I'm proud of it. And you're insulting me if you call me a person with autism. So call me autistic, right? And what it comes down to is just ask the person. It's very easy. It takes half a sentence and they'll tell you they're either autistic or they're a person with autism. And you just remember that and you just call them that. It's like with pronouns or anything else, right? So, I mean, ultimately, I don't think it's that hard. And I think when you're talking in general about Romani people, you can't really go wrong if you sort of say Romanese, because not everybody is Roma. But, so I think in general, it's kind of considered polite if you're speaking in general about the world's population of Romani people to not say gypsies. But mostly to me, it's about intent. And there's a lot of activists out there saying intent isn't magic. I'm like, it's not magic, but it's pretty important. If you intended to insult me, as opposed to you just intended to have a neutral kind of ethnonym, it's fine as long as you capitalize it, please. So the thing that I really can't stand is gypsy with a lowercase g, because it's like, would you ever write Jew with a lowercase j? You wouldn't. So what makes us so not worthy of the same consideration? So that's where I draw the line.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. I want to shift a little bit to bring Maestro Janáček into this whole thing. And Jeff, I want to turn to you for a second. As a composer who was sort of in the thick of trying to scribe, I mean, in this great article that you wrote to accompany the diary, you talk about Janáček's work in, much like Bartók, of the sort of the scribing of the world around him in as real a way as possible. How does that practice kind of jive with what can be seen as a very deep stereotypical view in the portrayal of Zefka? What is that? How does, as a conductor, as a musician, what does it feel like to you?
Yeah, well, I think Janáček's practice as a composer and folk ethnographer, in a musical sense, is there are three ways to think about it. One is through language, another is through music, and the third is through the combination of the two. And how that relates, if it relates at all, to to the taking account of Romani music and culture is another thing that I'll touch on at the end, I guess. But let me start by his folk music practice is actually really path breaking, in that people who are real fond of the folk music infusion in authentic folk music infusion as opposed to made up 19th century folk music imaginations in classical music. They think of Kodai and Bartók as the two people who most sort of prominently brought that in Hungary into the musical fold. And Janáček, to his credit, was actually before them. He went to the land around him, Silesia and Moravia, collecting folk music. The second piece of that is he was deeply interested, not necessarily in dialects, but in the different ways people spoke in the environment around him, as indices of their class to a certain extent, but maybe most importantly, their psychological situation. So that's another innovation of Janáček's, that he wanted to really, as a setter of text, try to access, at least as he saw it, this kind of psychological underpinning in the way people spoke, so that there was a melody that when somebody speaks with they say, how's your day going? And you say, it's going great. The way you would say it's going great if you were truly enthusiastic, as opposed to the way you would say it's going great if there's kind of some deep sadness in you, versus the way you'd say it's going great if you were being sarcastic. That to him was a richer well for musical expression than I think the usual practice of composers around the turn of the century would be. It was a complex set of theories that he worked out over a long time to try to weave those things together. The interest in folk music, the interest in just general speech, and the way in which those things can play or didn't play. So that's a fascinating sort of angle on Janáček. The extent to which that comes even close to actual Romani music around that area, I don't believe is very robust. And Petra can maybe help us with that. But the sense I have is that his music was his own language, that is to say, musical language and the Czech language. And that he had really no interest in doing folk research onto who Zefka might have been musically as a musical presence. Any resemblance to Zefka's real life musical environment would have been totally accidental in Janáček's frame. It's just he was the musical lens through which we meet these people.
Yeah, I don't. As far as I know, Janáček didn't have any access to Roma, and I mean most people didn't.
Right.
They their access would have been very kind of, just passing the Roma passing through, or they're maybe making use of the services of Roma, but it was rare that somebody would really kind of do the work to figure out who these people were. And even at the time, even there in the Moravia of his time, you already had, it would be hard to generalize about the Roma that were there, because you had nomadic ones, you had settled ones, had ones that were in the process of being settled. And you had a lot of Roma musically that were integrated very much into the kind of folk and even maybe sort of like classical milieu of the general population, in addition, to kind of having their own, so to speak, music. But that's neither here nor there, because I don't think Janáček had any thoughts or access to that in any way.
Well, this is drawing parallels a little bit to elsewhere in the operatic canon, when you have Puccini writing Madama Butterfly, and the sort of more notorious story about its creation, about it being based on a short story, which was then turned into a play by David Belasco, and then he sort of drew on both of those sources, and neither of the two of the source authors had ever been to Japan, had ever sort of done the work, and it was really based on this Orientalism, this exoticism sweeping Western culture. And are there parallels in that even though Janáček didn't have direct access necessarily to Roma music and performance, and to be able to be a proper ethnomusicologist in that respect, was there, as there is today, sort of the co-opting of Roma culture in either celebrations or clothes, or some sort of equivalent of the sort of chinoiserie of the 19th century?
If you're asking me, I think it was quite different from something like chinoiserie, because yeah, I mean, nobody wanted to wear Romany clothes the way now people do, right? There's all sorts of people be like, oh, I'm gonna wear the gypsy style. Completely different situation. And in fact, it is still you know, the things you see in America today with people dressing up as gypsies, we just don't have that in the Czech Republic or Slovakia. We're still so completely stigmatized that nobody wants to dress like a Romani person. It doesn't have that kind of what's the word? You don't get any cultural capital or whatever from that. So, and it's even different from, like, at the time, if you look at Russia, right? There you had noblemen, having liaisons and sometimes even marrying Romani women, and you had Roma in choirs. I mean, it was a very different situation, where there you could see, I think you might be able to see people sort of like, and I think you did see people kind of emulating, or really, hanging out with Roma, trying to get close to them, trying to sort of be like that, channel them in some way. But I think in the cultural situation that Janáček is in, it's a much more removed situation. So it really is this thing I'm talking about, where you're just kind of channeling some part of the psyche, and it isn't really like an ethnic imagery even necessarily. I don't know if that makes sense. There's sort of, there's the free-spirited thing, there's the stereotype of being thieves and not being subject to the laws of the land. But beyond that, I don't really see a lot of, trying to bring in sort of gypsiness the way that you would see in Russia, certainly, or even in Hungary.
That was that was a question that I wanted to ask you, is to what degree, and maybe now I can guess what you would say, but I'm curious if there's more to say about that, the Hungarian perspective, or the cross-pollination. There seems to have been more music, if I go back through my mental files, in the early part of the 20th century, coming out of Hungary, at least, and late 19th century, posturing as quasi, Romani music, authentic. I don't know, there's a whole swath that, from something like Kalman, Csárdás Fürsten, to fragments of symphonies by Dohnányi, that sort of thing.
Yeah, but in Hungary, you really had an incredible amount of cross-pollination. You first of all had a whole bunch of Romani musicians who were classically trained. And so even just the world of musicians was much more mixed, and even the world of composers, like, you have, we have records of Romani composers from the 18th and the 19th century contributing to, to the repertoire at large. We don't have that in Moravia, right? So, yes, it's geographically very similar, but I think culturally it's a different situation. I'm definitely not the ultimate expert on this by any means, but that's my sense that, Hungarians were trafficking in sort of gypsy music, not necessarily gypsiness, but gypsy music in a way that the Bohemians and the Moravians just weren't at all. And in fact, it would be much more expected that the Romani musicians that were around in Moravia would just play straight up Moravian music. And that was their role. It wasn't to kind of provide anything special.
Thanks. Yeah, that's interesting.
So looking specifically at about this piece, The Diary of One Who Vanished, Petra, I'd love your thoughts about now hearing from you, Jeff, that sort of Janáček's any kind of attempt to write authentic Romani music as it relates to Zefka seems non-existent, and that he was staying more closely hewn to his own personal musical voice. From a poetic standpoint, Petra, when you come across this text, to you, before the conversations we had months ago about this different tack that we were taking with the arc of the piece, just as at face value, for you, what is this poetry in sight for you?
Yeah, thank you for the question. You know I will answer it. I just want to, there are a couple of questions in the chat that I haven't answered. So before I forget, what prompted the mass settling of Roma 100 years or so years ago? Many Romani groups were already quite well settled, so I wouldn't sort of necessarily make that chronological rift, but the ones that were settling around that time, economic reasons, some of them, there was a bunch of forced settling, certainly under communism. For my mom's family, funny enough, at the time, the part of my mom's family that's from the Czech Republic, or that was in the Czech Republic as opposed to Slovakia, they were nomadic, and that was pretty rare in that part of the world, so it's not representative. And they settled down. I would say the Holocaust had a huge role in it, just just this general sense of like, we have to be a lot less, because almost all of them died. That entire family was almost completely wiped out, so the ones that survived had suddenly a lot more incentive to try to act as normal as possible. So that's one of the reasons, but there were various reasons. And then weren't they performing music at celebrations? I'm not sure which geographical area that's referring to, but yes, absolutely. In just about every part of Europe, there were Romani musicians performing at weddings and things like that. But again, the kind of music they were performing depends on what was expected of them. I mean, it was definitely like a dialogic process of what they provided versus what was expected. We see this to this day. I deal with this as a musician, like, what do people want? What do I want to give them? And we got to sort of meet in the middle. So again, I think in a place like Hungary or Russia, or especially Russia, it's like, oh, give us the most authentic gypsy stuff, Tsiganskaya muzika, because we really, it's just channeling our most whatever we're channeling, right? And you just don't have this in the Czech Republic. I don't know if that ever was a thing, but not that I know of. Okay, so my reactions to the text of such a work. So again, I'm going to be, brutally honest. It's yes, definitely a status symbol in Serbian weddings. Sorry, the brass bands are a big thing in the Balkans. Anyway, so the text brings up pretty nasty feelings in me, having gone through all sorts of situations of ranging from physical danger, having my kids physically assaulted in the Czech Republic, being told I'm trash, I'm a thief, there's no way I could actually be studying at Harvard. I mean, you name it. And I pass as white, so it's nothing compared to what almost everybody else in my family, including my kids, who were definitely brown, the two older ones anyway, long story. So this is sort of this is what comes up for me is everybody thinks we're thieves and they act that way towards us. So this is a real life thing that happens to us, and it's actually not just in Europe. It also happens to a different and a lot lesser extent, but still to a salient extent, in the United States. For example, I was in an internship as a music therapist, and I was basically accused of stealing or kind of somehow some strange mismanaging of money. I didn't do it, and I couldn't help thinking, and because the accusation was so absurd that it's hard not to sort of imagine that the fact that they knew about my ethnicity, in fact, they knew about my ethnicity without my telling them, because they found it on the internet, because I'm, I'm an activist and I'm a Romani musician, whatever, so I can't really hide, even though I can physically pass. So this kind of stuff comes up all the time. The idea of somebody's family rejecting you, that's definitely something that happened to me. Speaking of Serbia, I dated a Serbian guy in college. I mean, his family didn't want to hear about him dating a gypsy. I mean, this was just completely forbidden. So yeah, so it's not really poetry to me. It's real life, and it's the way that we're treated. And every single one of these texts is out there, and it absolutely informs on a daily basis the way that we are treated in schools, in employment settings, in hospitals, all over the place. So yeah, I can rationally separate the two, but not on that initial kind of emotional level.
Sure. No, thank you for sharing all that. And what's interesting to sort of process in all of that is in talking about that musical conversation about the lack of authenticity, or the sort of drawing on actual Romani music, what the verisimilitude is actually found in the ugliness of the situation, is what I'm hearing. That it is not poetry, but an accurate portrayal of the European against the Roma. And what is interesting also to think about is, even though this was pre-existing text that Janáček set, it is no secret that he projected this love story onto his own sort of misbegotten romantic adventures with a woman much younger than him, who was not Roma. But this projection of the exotic, of the forbidden thing, yet the conflict that created, I think, in the creation of this piece, that his love for Camilla was so deep, yet what the text sets up is this real this loathing, this hatred that we looked at and it was to Jeff's incredible credit to sort of raise this question for us as an organization at the very beginning of this project, is what are we doing when talking about doing this piece in English, especially when we started these conversations in June and July, when the climate all over the world was fueled by protests and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and all of those conversations, but then to extend that for American artistic thinking and American audiences, to bring Roma into that conversation, that the acknowledgement of Roma as an ethnic group, gypsies with a capital G, is one of the first things I remember you saying to me when we first spoke many months ago, and broadening understanding of that. And for us, the path we took through all of this, perhaps as art presents us with it, it gives us an opportunity for revision, to use source material in sort of reconsideration of things, and having the chance to perform this piece in English, looking at the depth of Janáček's love for Zefka, and that what drove us in our change. And those of you who have gotten the diary packet for this will have read the supplementary material about our desire to change some of the uses and instances of gypsy, rather than doing a direct translation of the Czech, to chart a path for Janáček whereby he begins from this place, as Petra, you're describing, of the closed-minded, the ignorant Moravian, that he comes from a culture and a place of believing these stereotypes without question. And so when he falls in love with this woman who represents this other community, how could this possibly happen? There's this and the understanding of, oh wow, that and much like you said at the beginning, in your comparison of Roma to the Jewish population, it's sort of like, well, which you can then say, well, Jews are just like Christians, and by the transitive property, we are in fact all alike. And when Janáček comes to understand that, the path he goes on to try and educate himself, which I think we as an organization are hoping has any ripple throughout those of you out there who are listening to this song cycle, in that it presents an opportunity to reevaluate. That there are straightforward presentations of this cycle where there is no question that these things are steeped in hatred, and that Janáček does nothing to disabuse himself or the listener of those things. But it is our hope through this that we can redirect a little bit. And Petra, I would love your thoughts on that, but also your thoughts on opera in general, which is littered with these stereotypical portrayals of Roma. We have Carmen. You have the sort of the co-opting and assimilation of Romani music. Are we at a place where those portrayals, those pieces, even this very piece, need to be stricken from performance, or is there a value in using them as sort of reinterpretive tools and conversation starters moving forward?
Yeah, I think reinterpretive tools, maybe, depending on the situation. Again, I think what you've done here is fine. There's room for that, at least to some extent, in this particular song cycle. Some works are maybe irredeemable in that regard. Let's see. So yeah, I wouldn't strike anything. I think starting these conversations is really important, and not just looking at the works themselves and sort of, it's always hard to sort of not even just judge, but to analyze, the situation of somebody in a different country so many years ago, but to look at the reception history, which to me is just as, if not more important than these works themselves. What has it done? How has it rippled into the actual lives of both the majority populations and minority populations, not just like Roma and Europeans, but all kinds of populations, right? There's even, you can look at particular relationships that African Americans have had to sort of like gypsy themes, right? So there's that whole thing to look at. So none of that is to be discounted, none of that is to be forgotten. I think all of that is to be discussed and looked at and examined, so we can kind of move somewhere from that. Something like Carmen, I'll say it again, I said it last time, we activists love to hate Carmen. We sort of feminist Romani activists especially. I, as the mother of a 14-year-old Romani girl who looks like a woman, to see any kind of work that over-sexualizes Roma and makes that portrayal of the gypsy woman the way Carmen does, as a mother, I have nothing nice to say about it. I really don't. So I've said it before, I love the music. I wish the entire libretto would just disappear. That, I would not cry if people, put on Carmen with a totally different story and characters or whatever. Is that a prescriptive thing? No, I'm just, again, sort of giving you my emotional reaction. And it's funny because in my own family, my mother actually sort of sings, it's funny, this was not the case, but in her, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, when she was around 50, she decided she was going to take singing lessons. I mean, she was already a fine singer of like Romani music and jazz, pop, whatever. And she decided she wanted to study opera. At the time, I was like, Mom, you lost your mind, because why would you do that? Like, but she stuck with it and she loves it, and so she has sung Carmen arias on stage, and I just sort of go, Mom, what are you thinking? You have no self-respect. Where's your dignity? I mean, I can't take it. And my son, is a really excellent musician who loves Carmen because it's really great music. He just does it to annoy me. I mean, he'll just play it over and over again. Because he's autistic and he plays a lot of things over and over again. But there you go. Andrew didn't start singing opera until you were 45. Yeah, I mean, it's great. My thing with my mom was she was such an accomplished singer that I felt like she could go on stage and just rock the place singing jazz. And she didn't do that. And she decided to just start from scratch for something that she didn't know anything about. And so I was trying to sort of protect her, but of course, it was misguided. But anyway, now my son's latest thing, I came back, he was actually here with my parents. I was in the Czech Republic. I missed him terribly. And now he's decided that his latest obsession is the musical Gypsy. I'm like, you're just doing that to annoy me. Like, come on, because it's like, then you have people naming their dogs Gypsy and like, whatever. And I'm like, I have nothing against it, but it's just sort of this, like, it just makes me bristle. And I think he does. It's hilarious. But the point is, you're going to have different, legitimate relationships from different Roma. And I think last time we touched on this too, and I think it's really important because we're at this place where the loudest voices right now are voices like mine, the sort of academic / activist voice saying, this is, these are the problems, these are the reverberations, words have power, blah, blah, blah. We need to completely rework how we use words. And that is not wrong. I'm not going to say that everything I've ever done is wrong, but I am going to say that those aren't the only voices, right? And so sometimes when all we see are the voices on Twitter that are kind of, they have some institution somewhere, they have an organization behind them, or they're just a 20-year-old college student. It's a particular type of person. I don't think there's any college students in this bunch, so I can say it. I mean, I was a 20-year-old college student, and there's no nuance, right? It's very often there's no nuance in that thinking. And that's a lot of the people that we hear. And I think, that's lovely, but we have to hear all the voices, including the ones that say, hey, go ahead and culturally appropriate my culture's stuff. I don't mind, right? Those voices are out there. Go ahead and represent my people as fiery and passionate, because I identify with that. I mean, there are tons of Roma who do. I think it's this kind of false consciousness. I think it's, internalizing stereotypes, and I would have a sit down with them and question that. But the fact is, it's not my place to, tell them it's wrong.
Right.
That's, and if they're a musician or a dancer, they make their money off of internalizing that stereotype, either really internalizing it or at least projecting an internalization of a stereotype, because that's what people want to hear. And one of my best sort of, my son's godfather and my godson's father, a bandmate, I mean, we have an ongoing, just completely different set of ideas, and ultimately comes down to the fact that he is fundamentally a professional musician. This is how he makes his money, and I don't. It's a hobby for me, right? Okay, Gwen, did you feel the same way about the libretto of Carmen? If Carmen were not Romany, I mean, yes, because, and I mean, it wouldn't be, I think there are other over-sexualized ethnic groups out there, right? And Roma are one of them. So it would depend on the group. But if we had that same libretto and it was just like, some girl from New Jersey, then I might have issues, maybe some kind of issue with it as a feminist, but it wouldn't be at all the same issue, because it's not that particular idea of like, oh, you're, sexy gypsy, right? Like there are no particular, maybe there are sexy Jersey girl Halloween costumes, I don't know, but the whole phenomenon of the of the sexy Halloween costume again. It's ridiculous, and I do think that ultimately it endangers my kid. You know, I mean, do I have incontrovertible proof of that? No, but I think I have some sociological proof.
For sure. And your story about your mother has inspired several of our guests to share their own starting points of their own operatic studies. So well done, everybody. You can start studying opera whenever you want. The more the merrier. And also, Dina raises the point through what you talked about with the sort of problematic relationship of ethnic group or racial group to a piece that is performed that sort of is self-generating, and that's Porgy and Bess in the African American community, which is a panel discussion unto itself for sure. But I've had many conversations with colleagues and friends about, and there have been articles written about the Porgy effect and and African Americans' role in perpetuating the success of the piece, and it can't be done without African American performers. It is often one of the few more accessible opportunities for younger singers of color, and the conundrum that many people find themselves in with the text of the piece, with the cultural representations of the piece. So again, I think this is a conversation that is clearly linked to something like Carmen, which many people do not think about the same way. And so a conversation like this, I am grateful for, in that it opens my own lens of understanding. And to that end, Petra, how can all of us learn more about Romani culture and continue our own process of education?
All right, the fun part. Okay, I'm putting this in the chat. So it's so simple now that we have Rome Archive. www.romearchive.eu. It's your one-stop resource. I was the head music curator. Don't judge. So much stuff just has not gotten up there yet because of various technical issues. So it's kind of totally haphazard and random. But my favorite parts of the archive have nothing to do with music. You can just ignore music. The literature section, the voices of the victims section, the visual art section, I think, is pretty cool too. Even like theater, I learned so much, honestly. Like my idea of Romani theater, and this is so embarrassing because I was called upon to be one of the curators, and I was like, oh, it's the Russian theater where we have the colorful costumes and we do the stereotypical everything, and it's like really great music. And then there's theaters that emulate that. I mean, that was the extent of my knowledge of Romani theater, and I was so embarrassed when I realized that there's like various totally avant-garde groups of Roma doing amazingly, progressive things, and I'd never heard of them. So don't be me. Use the resource now that it's there. Rome Archive. It also has some, sort of general history stuff like that. And actually, the Wikipedia article is not bad. Last I checked, it's actually pretty good. So I don't mind sending people for that, but just like your bare bones kind of background.
Great. Amazing. Well, thank you again for such an incredible revisiting of this topic. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Thank you, Jeff, as always. If there are any other questions, I mean, keep talking to each other, keep learning, and we're gonna keep doing what we're doing and trying to spark these conversations. So Petra, thank you. Jeff, thank you. Everyone, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the great questions. Really good set of questions.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.